If you can't control your mind, you will lose, even when you know exactly what to do. You've already seen this play out. You sit down to work. The task is clear. You're not confused. You even planned this moment earlier. But within minutes, your focus shifts. You check something small, your phone, a message, a random thought. That small break turns into 10 minutes. Then 20. Now the urgency is gone. Nothing external stopped you. Your mind did. And this is where the real problem begins, not in action, but in control. Because you still believe you're in charge. You think you're making decisions. But most of what you're doing is reaction. You feel something, and you follow it. You think something, and you act on it. There's no separation between impulse and behavior. That's why consistency feels unstable. You're not operating from a fixed position. You're being pulled by distraction, by emotion, by temporary comfort. And every time you follow that pull, you reinforce it. So the issue isn't that you lack discipline. It's that your mind has no structure. It moves when it wants, shifts when it feels like it, and you go with it. That's why you can plan your day perfectly and still lose it in small moments. That's why you can set goals and still drift away from them without noticing. Because control isn't happening where it needs to. In this video, you're going to see exactly how your mind is quietly directing your behavior, why you keep losing control in moments that seem insignificant, and what it actually means to take control, not in theory, but in daily execution. Because if you don't fix this, it won't matter how good your plan is. You'll keep losing, one small decision at a time. What's happening inside your mind follows a pattern, and once you see it clearly, the loss of control stops looking random. There are 4 mechanisms driving this. The first is impulse attachment. The moment a thought appears, check your phone, delay the task, switch to something easier, you don't observe it, you attach to it. There's no gap between the thought and your action. That's why control disappears so quickly. You're not choosing, you're reacting instantly. The second is the attention drift cycle. Your focus isn't stable, it gradually leaks. It starts with something small, one distraction, and instead of correcting it, you allow your attention to scatter. Over time, your mind normalizes this scattered state, making deep focus feel unnatural. The third is emotional override. When something feels slightly uncomfortable, boredom, resistance, mental fatigue, you treat that feeling as a signal to stop or change direction. Instead of holding position, you adjust your behavior to reduce discomfort. That trains your mind to avoid pressure instead of handling it. The fourth is the false reset belief. You assume that losing control in one moment can be fixed later by getting back on track. But control doesn't work in blocks, it works in moments. Every time you lose control and delay correction, you strengthen the habit of drifting. Here's how it looks in real life. You're working on something important. A notification pops up. You tell yourself you'll check it quickly. That's impulse attachment. Then you scroll for a few minutes, attention drift. You feel slightly tired, so you stay off task longer, emotional override. Finally, you think, I'll refocus later, false reset. Nothing extreme happened. But control is gone. And this pattern repeats daily. Once you recognize these mechanisms, one thing becomes clear: you're not losing because of big failures. You're losing control in small, unnoticed moments, and letting them pass without correction. Control doesn't disappear all at once. It slips in small moments where you stop holding your position. The first place this shows up is in how you handle thoughts the moment they appear. A thought enters your mind, something simple, like checking a notification or shifting to an easier task. Most people don't even recognize this as a decision point. It feels automatic. But that's exactly the problem. Because the moment you act on every thought without resistance, you lose separation between stimulus and response. And without that separation, control doesn't exist. Consider a work situation. You're in the middle of something that requires sustained focus. The task isn't hard, it's just steady. Then a thought appears, check something quickly. It feels harmless. You follow it. Now you've stepped out of the task. At this point, you still have control, but only if you return immediately. Most people don't. They allow that one action to open the door to another. And then another. Not because they planned it, but because they didn't interrupt it. That's the mechanism. Control isn't lost when the thought appears. It's lost when the thought goes unchallenged. And over time, this becomes your default mode, automatic reaction instead of deliberate action. Now shift this into financial behavior. You set a clear boundary, spending, saving, something structured. Then one small impulse shows up. A purchase that wasn't planned. Again, not a major issue. But what matters is the follow-up. If you absorb the mistake and return to the boundary immediately, control holds. If you expand it, it's already off, I'll adjust later, you've just converted one action into a pattern. And this is where most people misunderstand control. They think it's about avoiding mistakes entirely. It's not. It's about limiting the impact of those mistakes to the smallest possible unit. One decision. Not a chain. But if your mind is used to expanding small slips into larger deviations, you lose that containment. And once containment is gone, control disappears quickly. The second layer of this problem is attention stability. Most people don't train their attention, they let it move freely. At first, this doesn't seem serious. You still get things done. You still function. But over time, your ability to stay with one thing starts to weaken. You sit down to focus, and within minutes, your mind looks for exits. Not because the task is unbearable, but because your attention has been conditioned to shift. Now you're not just dealing with distraction. You're dealing with a mind that resists stillness. This shows up clearly in long-term planning. Someone decides to work toward a larger goal, something that requires months or years of steady input. At the beginning, there's energy, direction, clarity. But as the process becomes repetitive, attention starts drifting. They look for variation, something new, something stimulating. And slowly, they move away from the original path. Not because it stopped working, but because their attention couldn't stay with it. That's not a strategy problem. That's a control problem. There's a simple line that captures this from Rohn: you must take personal responsibility. Most people interpret that as ownership of outcomes. But it starts earlier. It starts with ownership of attention. If you can't direct your attention where it needs to go, and keep it there, everything else becomes unstable. The third layer is emotional tolerance. Every task that matters carries some level of discomfort. Not pain, just resistance. Boredom. Effort. Friction. And this is where your mind starts negotiating. It looks for relief. A small break. A delay. A shift in activity. None of these feel significant. But together, they train your system to escape pressure instead of holding it. Now apply this to physical discipline. Someone trying to stay consistent with training or routine wakes up slightly tired. Not exhausted. Just not fully ready. This is where emotional tolerance is tested. If they move anyway, adjusting intensity but keeping the action, they build control. If they delay or skip, they reinforce a different pattern. Only act when it feels manageable. That condition seems reasonable. But it slowly removes your ability to act under normal resistance. Because most meaningful actions don't feel comfortable in the moment. So now your system is waiting for a state that rarely arrives. And when it doesn't, nothing happens. There's a quiet example of this in everyday environments. Someone decides to limit distractions in their evening, reduce unnecessary screen time, focus on something constructive. The first few days, it works. Then one evening, they feel mentally drained. They think, I just need something easy tonight. Again, not a dramatic failure. But what matters is repetition. If that choice becomes the response to fatigue, it creates a loop. Fatigue escape loss of structure. And over time, that loop becomes automatic. This is how control erodes, not through major decisions, but through consistent small allowances. The final layer is the belief in delayed correction. This is the idea that you can lose control now and fix it later. It sounds harmless, even practical, but it breaks the system, because control only exists in the present moment. You can't correct a pattern tomorrow if you're reinforcing it today. Every time you delay correction, you strengthen the behavior you're trying to change. And eventually, it becomes your baseline. This is why people feel stuck even when they understand what to do. They keep postponing control, waiting for a better moment, a clearer state, a fresh start. But that moment doesn't fix anything, because the pattern wasn't interrupted when it mattered. So the shift becomes clear. Control is not about managing your entire day perfectly. It's about handling the exact moment where your mind tries to move you off track and not following it, even once. Because every time you interrupt that movement, you create space. And in that space, control exists. At this point, control should no longer feel abstract. It's not something you build over time in a general sense. It's something you enforce in specific moments, especially the small ones most people ignore. Because that's where identity is shaped. Right now, your mind still assumes it has authority. A thought appears, and it expects to be followed. A feeling shows up, and it expects to dictate behavior. That expectation didn't form overnight, it was trained through repetition. But it can also be removed the same way. Not by overpowering your mind with intensity, but by quietly refusing to obey it when it moves in the wrong direction. That's the shift. You're not trying to control everything. You're deciding which signals deserve a response, and which ones don't. And once that boundary is clear, your behavior stabilizes. This is where compounding becomes real. Not in large visible progress, but in the consistency of control. Every time you hold your position when your mind tries to drift, you reinforce something deeper than discipline, you reinforce authority. You become someone who doesn't react automatically. Someone who can feel discomfort without adjusting behavior. Someone who can notice distraction without following it. That's where self-respect begins to take form. Not in what you say you'll do, but in how often you actually follow through when it would be easier not to. Because self-respect isn't built on perfect performance. It's built on reliability. If your actions keep changing based on internal fluctuations, you can't rely on yourself. But if your actions remain stable, even when your internal state isn't, you create something solid. And that solidity carries forward. It removes hesitation. It simplifies decisions. It reduces internal noise. So instead of asking how to control your mind, the question becomes more precise. What are you no longer willing to follow? Because once that line is drawn, control stops being something you chase and becomes something you exercise quietly, repeatedly, without negotiation. At this stage, there's nothing new to learn. Only something to recognize. You already know where control is breaking. It's not in your long-term goals. Not in your understanding. Not in your ability to plan. It's in the moment right before action, when something smaller tries to take over. And you usually let it. Not because you're unaware, but because it feels insignificant. A quick check. A short delay. A small comfort. A single exception. That's how control dissolves, quietly, under permission that feels harmless at the time. But now you can see what those small moments actually are. They are decisions about authority. Either you lead the action, or the impulse does. There is no neutral space in between. So the real question isn't whether you can be disciplined in general. It's whether you can stay consistent in the exact instant your mind tries to negotiate. Because negotiation is the beginning of loss. This one time. Just for a moment. I'll fix it later. Every pattern of lack of control speaks in that language first. And every person who regains control eventually does one thing differently. They stop responding to everything that appears in their mind as if it deserves action. Not because thoughts disappear, but because obedience ends. This is where the shift becomes permanent. You don't need more motivation. You don't need a different system. You don't need a new version of yourself. You need a narrower rule. Do not follow every internal signal. Once that rule is lived, not just understood, something changes structurally. Your mind still produces noise, but it no longer directs behavior by default. And in that gap, real control exists. Not loud. Not emotional. Not dramatic. Just consistent refusal to drift. That's what creates stability. And stability is what eventually becomes identity. So when you strip everything else away, the message is simple. You don't lose control in big moments. You lose it in the ones you don't respect enough to interrupt. And every time you choose not to interrupt it, you are training the same pattern you claim to want to escape. At some point, that has to stop being accidental. It has to become a decision. Not later. Now.